يا أيها الناس قد جاءكم برهان من ربكم وأنزلنا إليكم نورا مبينا.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. O Allah, open my heart, make my task easy for me, and remove the knots from my tongue, so they may understand my speech. So to recap the aims of each of the lessons that we're going to cover, we will look at the letter names and the phonetic sound of each letter and the articulation point of each letter, which in Arabic we call the Makhraj. For each letter, we will pronounce it with one of the three short vowels on, Fatha, Kasra, Dhamma, and we will also pronounce the letter with Sukoon, which means free from one of these short vowels. So every letter in the Arabic alphabet will either have one of the short vowels on them or a sukoon on them. And a letter which is empty in the Quran is also in the state of sukoon. So the sukoon can be visible or it can be completely empty, i.e. it can be invisible, so it's still in the state of sukoon. So this is the next thick letter that we've come across in the Arabic alphabet. So far we've had the letter Kha, which is a thick letter all the time. And we've had letter Ra, which can be pronounced thick with Fatha and Dhamma and thin with Kasra. The letter Sad, letter name Sad, pronounced as the English word sword, and the phonetic sound is Sa, as SAW, the English word Sa. So the Sad is a letter which is always thick. It's always pronounced with thickness. So it has the same articulation points as the Sin and the Zai, which we've covered a few slides previously. So the Makhraj of the three letters is the same, which is the tip of the tongue touching behind the lower incisors, and again we have to leave a gap. So you can see here the comparison between the Zai in the Sin and the Sad is that the tongue is elevated and the entire upper surface of the tongue is used because it possesses certain characteristics which involve elevation of the entire upper surface of the tongue. There's a narrowing in the throat, there's elevation of sound, and there's echoing sound. So it's pronounced with elevation of sound and echo of sound. So when it's pronounced with Fatha, Dhamma, Kasra, Sa, Su, Si. And when it's pronounced with a Sukoon, you can hear the characteristics, which in Arabic we call the sifat, of the letter very clearly. S, S. So the Sad has the sound is running and the breath is running. So you can hear both the sound and the breath running. And you can see when it's written at the beginning or the middle of a letter, then the bottom half of the Sad will not be there. It's only written in its full form when it's written at the end of the word. So we have another thick letter. We have letter name is Dad and the phonetic sound is Da. So you'll often hear the Arabic language being nicknamed as the language of Dad. So the Dad is specific to the Arabic language, which is why it's one of the most difficult letters to pronounce because it's not pronounced in any other language. So the Makhraj of Dad, the articulation point of Dad, is the furthest edges of the tongue. So the furthest edges of the tongue touching the upper molar teeth. So this is the Makhraj of Dad, and it's a thick letter, so the sound is elevated, so it possesses the characteristics of elevation. So the sound is elevated. There's a concaving in the tongue. There's an echo sound, strong echo sound in the mouth. The entire upper surface of the tongue is elevated towards the upper surface of the mouth, towards the roof of the mouth. And there's a narrowing in the throat here. So when it's pronounced with a da, du, di, fatha, dhamma, kasra, da, du, di. And previously we had the dal on lesson 1, which is pronounced from the tip of the tongue. So care needs to be taken that the tip of the tongue is not used for the Lord. Like da, do, di is the tip of the tongue. So make sure that you're not using the tip, but you are actually using the furthest edges of the tongue, which we can see on the next slide, with the upper molar teeth. So stay clear from the makhraj, the tip of the tongue when you're pronouncing da, da, bu, di. And when it's pronounced with a sukoon, then the characteristics are quite clear. So you'll hear certain characteristics which we will discuss in further lessons, inshallah. So in this slide we can see the area which is used for the letter Dad. So the purple area is where the pressure is built up. So you have to start on the furthest point of the tongue in your mouth with the adjacent to the upper molar teeth until you reach the front of the mouth, the front area of the tongue. So da, bu, di. So the pressure has to be on the either one edge or both edges can be used. Da, bu, di, and ab. So when it's pronounced with a sukoon, then ab. So again, you have to make sure that this pressure is built up on the edges of the tongue when you're pronouncing the letter. So the letter name is ta, and the phonetic sound is also ta. The ta shares its articulation point with the letters dal and ta, which we've had previously, which were both thin letters. So you can see the difference here, that the articulation point is the same, i.e. the tip of the tongue is touching the roots of the upper incisors, but you can see, because it's a thick letter and it possesses certain characteristics, you can see that the tongue is elevated again, and you can see that the entire upper surface of the tongue is elevated towards the roof of the mouth, and there's also concaving in the middle of the tongue, and there's narrowing in the throat. So the ta is a thick letter and an elevated letter compared to the dal and the ta, which were thin letters and they were lowered letters where the sound was lowered. And you can see here the narrowing in the throat. We narrow the throat by using this ligament here, which is attached to the epiglottis and the hyoid bone, by pushing this open, which pushes the epiglottis open towards the back of the throat, causing a narrowing in the throat, which causes an echo sound in the mouth. Ta, ta. So when it's pronounced with fatha, dhamma, kasra, ta, tu, ti. And when it's pronounced with a sukoon, then you can hear the sifat clearly, and the ta is another letter of qalqala, which we've had previously, where the sound is bounced. So we have bouncing of the sound off the articulation point. Ato, ato. So far we've had ba, which was a qalqala letter, the jim, which was a qalqala letter, and we're having the ta. Aba, aja, ato, ato. So the letter name of this letter is dha, and the phonetic sound is also dha. And the letter dha shares its articulation points with the dhal and tha, which we've had previously. So three letters have the same articulation point: dhal, tha, and dha. The difference being that the dhal and the tha were thin letters and lowered letters, where the sound is lowered, and the dha is a thick letter and an elevated letter, where the sound is elevated. So again, the articulation point of this letter is the tip of the tongue touching the lower edge of the upper incisors, and you can see that the back of the tongue is elevated, the sound is elevated, the upper surface of the tongue is raised towards the roof of the mouth, and we have an concaving in the middle of the tongue, we have an echo in the mouth, and again we have narrowing in the throat. So all of these have to be apparent in the dha in order to pronounce it correctly, otherwise it will sound like a dhal, there. If we don't do all of this, then it will become a dha, which is a thin letter. So with the fatha, dhamma, kasra. So remember the mechanism of of the shape of your mouth when you have one of the three vowels. So for a fatha, we should have a vertical opening, dha, dha. We shouldn't be circling the lips for fatha. Common mistake which many people make to make a letter thick is by circling the lips, which is incorrect. The only time we circle the lips is when we have a dhamma on the letter, or if we have a waw, which involves circling the lips to pronounce, because that's the articulation point of the circling of the lips when pronouncing waw. So with a dha, we're at the makhraj of dha and we open vertically to give the fatha sound, dha. And for the dhamma, dhu. So we're at the articulation point of the dha and we circle the lips because it's carrying a dhamma, dhu, dhu. And for a kasra, we have to lower the jaw. Again, don't say dhi. Don't use your lips. You have to just lower the jaw and be at the articulation point of the letter and then lower the jaw. Dhi, dha, dhu, dhi. And when it's with the sukoon, you can clearly hear the sifat, i.e. the characteristics. L, L. So it's a thick letter, so it shouldn't sound like a dal. L, L. The dha is a thick letter, so everything should be, the sound should be elevated. There should be an echo, strong echo in the mouth. L, L, when it's pronounced. And you can see when it's written the same whether it's at the beginning, middle, or end of the word. It's written in the same form. So these four letters have one thing in common. They all have trapping of sound between the tongue and the palate. So the sound is trapped, as you can see by the green arrows in all of the letters. These letters have an increase in elevation of sound and thickness of the letter because of the close position of the tongue to the palate. So you can see that the space between the tongue and the palate is quite is very little compared to the rest of the letters of the Arabic alphabet. So therefore we have an increase in elevation of sound and we have an increase in the thickness of a letter. So these letters have to be differentiated from, so for example the sad has to be differentiated from the sin, the dad has to be differentiated from the dal, the ta has to be differentiated from the ta, and the dha has to be differentiated from the ta. So these letters are thick letters, they're elevated letters, and they also have a trapping of sound between the tongue and the palate, which increases in their thickness and the elevation of the sound. So sa, dha, ta, dha. To summarize the mechanism of making these letters thick, so these letters, the sad, dad, ta, dha, are always thick. The sound is always elevated, resulting in the rising of the back of the tongue. And the sound is trapped between the tongue and the palate because we have the elevation of the entire upper surface of the tongue towards the roof of the mouth, creating a narrow space between the tongue and the palate where the sound is trapped. And there is also concaving in the middle of the tongue, resulting in a strong echo sound in the mouth. And as the tongue is thickened, there is a narrowness in the throat. So these are the mechanisms of making these letters thick. So to summarize, the sad and the dad have the same letter shape. The dad has a dot above and the sad has no dots, and you can see the shape when it's written at the beginning and the middle for both of them. The end of the shape is not visible, so you can only see the full shape of the letter when it's written at the end of a word. And the ta and the dha have the same shape. Difference is that the dha has the dots and the ta doesn't, and they look the same whether it's written in the middle or if it's written at the beginning or end of the word. Da, du, di. Sa, su, si. Ta, tu, ti. Dha, vu, vi. And with sukoon. So listen out for the characteristics that you can hear. Ad. A common mistake with the dad is that students often do qalqala, i.e. vibrate it, and it's not one of the vibration letters. It's not ado. So be careful that you give it the correct sound when it's with a sukoon. S, S, ato. So this one has qalqala. Ato. It has a vibration sound. L, L, L. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. O Allah, glory be to you, and all praise is due to you. I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship besides you, and I seek forgiveness from you, and I return to you in obedience.
وأن أتلو القرآن فمن اهتدى فإنما يهتدي لنفسه ومن ضل فقل إنما أنا من المنذرين